Afternoon, CSPC. Bonjour tout le monde. So here we are on the last day of the conference, and it's certainly been a whirlwind of a week. I hope you've all enjoyed the conference and have soaked up all the knowledge and brain power on offer. Um, I've said it in a couple of the other sessions, but I'll say it again. I am hopefully cautiously looking forward to seeing you all in person next year. So if we've never met, I'm Rachel Maxwell, and I'm the Executive Director at Evidence for Democracy, E4D for short, Canada's leading nonprofit dedicated to advancing the transparent use of science and evidence in public life and public policy. I know it's a mouthful, but if you are interested in us, I encourage you to check us out. But first, before we dive into the session, or panel 510 as it is also known, I would like to acknowledge the land from which I'm joining today. But with many of us tuning in from different communities and different parts of the country, I encourage you to take a moment to think about the history of the land that you yourself are located on. So I am located in Ottawa, which is on the traditional unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So while we take a moment to acknowledge this, let's all recognize the history and continuation of colonialism on this land, and for all the settlers on the call to think about the benefits that we experience because of this history, and how we can do our best to respect and stand in solidarity with those who were here first. Okay, so moving us along here, I will be moderating the final plenary today, and I'm really excited about the topic. In fact, I couldn't think of a better way to close out the conference than by talking about the next generation of leaders in science policy. So welcome to panel 510, otherwise known as lessons learned from the student-run science policy groups and youth advisory bodies in Canada. So we are going to be taking a look at the growing interest and indeed growing critical mass, I would say, of student-led science policy organizations in Canada, and hearing about the strengths and opportunities that come alongside these groups. Because across the country and in our post-secondary institutions, we're seeing a growing interest amongst trainees and early career researchers to build the skills that they need to be effective at the science policy interface. But there remain limited opportunities to do so. So the limited number of student-run science policy organizations and advisory bodies that do exist definitely fill a critical gap, but they don't have the capacity to engage the ever-growing number of next-gen leaders in science policy. It's kind of a good problem to have. So to get into this discussion, we're going to be hearing from speakers from different groups to discuss their experiences in this space, and hear about the challenges and successes they've encountered and how we can further broaden science policy capacity in the next generation. I'm sure you've peeked at their bios, but I'm going to name them quickly here. So we have Shivani Bhaskaran from the Toronto Science Policy Network, and who is also currently a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. Et puis, nous avons Sarah Bitter, qui travaille au Fonds de recherche du Québec et qui occupe un poste d'analyste à la gestion et à la planification stratégique. Bienvenue, Sarah. And just a note, too, that this panel is actually bilingual. So we have Sarah, who's going to be speaking to us in French, but we have a number of other folks on this panel that speak both French and English. And so when you're posing your questions in the discussion or in the Q&A, feel free to drop them in either English or French. Then we have Sean McGurk, who is presently working at NSERC, who seems to have been involved in sort of everything. He's been part of the Science and Policy Exchange out of McGill for many years, and is also an alumnus of the MyTax Science Policy Fellowship and the Government of Canada's Recruitment of Policy Leaders program. And he's also on the board of ACFAS in Quebec. Then we have Taylor Morisseau, who is an Indigenous scholar and PhD candidate at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba. She's also an alumna of Equal Voices Daughters of the Vote, Indigenize the Senate, and the Summer Internship for Indigenous People in Genomics, which is a really awesome program. I'm a big fan. Taylor also serves on the Chief Science Advisor's Youth Council. And finally, we have Uzma Arouj, who is a senior policy advisor at Innovation, Science, and Economic Development, and who holds a PhD from the University of York in cognitive neuroimaging. It's an embarrassment of riches on this panel, to be honest. So that's the gist of what we'll be covering today. But I want to add, before we get into the discussion with the speakers here, I just want to add a little bit of extra commentary. Unfortunately, I think that it can be too easy to overlook the student perspective in policy spaces and in spaces where decisions are being made. But the student perspective is unique. It is unique in that it knows, even if for a fleeting moment when, typically we're not students forever, it knows what is needed most at that point in time to support trainees and early career researchers. And at the same time, that perspective, at least as far as I've experienced, has a great appetite for the future and in particular for a better future. Talent developing and emerging from our post-secondary institutions demonstrates great dedication to looking around the table and asking who's not here or who are we missing. This kind of openness and inclusiveness is critical to well-rounded decisions and certainly at a chance for a more equitable future. So everyone who has attended this conference, whether from academia, government, industry, civil society, and nonprofits, everyone has a role to play in making room for their voices and offering them the opportunities and experiences that will develop their skills and their capacity to lead us into the very murky waters of the decades ahead. So without further ado, let's move into discussion. So I'm going to pose some pointed questions to each of our panelists. Maybe I'll just pause for a second. So we are going to hear from each of them individually. We're going to have a bit of moderated discussion as well. And of course, we have time set aside for questions from our attendees today. So each panelist is going to speak about their organization and their experiences. But I'm also going to pose a question to each of them when I cue them in. So each of you have served in different capacities in various student-run science policy groups and youth advisory bodies in Canada. So let's dig into some of the challenges you faced. We're going to start with Shivani. So Shivani, tell us about yourself. And the question I have for you is, what are some of the challenges involved in founding a student science policy group? Over to you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon. My name is Savani Bhaskaran. I'm here representing the Toronto Science Policy Network. And a little bit about me to start. I'm a PhD student at U of T. I'm an environmental chemist by training, so I study chemical properties important to chemical risk assessments. And I'm a past co-founder and a past president of the Toronto Science Policy Network. So what is TSPN? TSPN is an interdisciplinary student group at the University of Toronto. We started in 2018 as a way for us to learn more about the science policy landscape in Canada. A lot of us were interested in science policy. We didn't know how to get started. We didn't know really much about it at all. So we started this group as a way to learn more. And our membership includes folks in chemistry, in psychology, in physics and engineering and genomics, and a wide range of other disciplines. Our current structure of TSPN is primarily based on a 10-person executive team, all current U of T students. And we also have volunteers from various institutional backgrounds and some alumni as well from different institutions and from within TSPN. Currently, the TSPN mandate is to provide a platform for students and postdocs to learn about and engage in science policy. And we do this by raising awareness and providing basic training on topics related to science policy for everyone interested, whether they be students, postdocs, even staff and faculty sometimes join us. And we work with the community to advocate for science-based policy and to promote communication on the science behind key policy topics. And so we are really working to expand on the science policy interface and working within that interface. And so we do this a few different ways. So we have our panels, our Just the Facts panels, which help educate and inform about the importance of science to society. And then on the other hand, we have one-on-one workshops and TSPN talks, which really provide training on how to engage in policy for scientists. We then have our campaigns where we advocate for the use of evidence-informed policy. So this includes participating in Vote Science, writing letters to MPs. And then, of course, we have advocating for increased support for science and early career researchers through various campaigns like surveys, op-eds, and memo writing. So TSPN is about 3 years old now. We're entering our 4th year, and we're a growing community of students engaged and interested in science policy at U of T. We're now over 300 people on our mailing list, which is kind of amazing when you think about we started with 5 people barely 3 years ago. And over the years, we've held over 20 events with hundreds of attendees, and we're continuing to build connections and collaborations across Canada. One great example is these kind of panels and events that we are able to participate in and showcase TSPN's past work. And of course, we have some major initiatives that we've accomplished, like our report on the early impacts of COVID-19 on graduate students across Canada. We recently published a policy memo on improving accessibility of federal graduate research awards in Canada. And then we have our various events, which are open not just to U of T students, but to anyone interested in attending and participating in national campaigns like Vote Science in 2019 and 2021. So why do we want to get involved in science policy? Why get involved in TSPN? Many of us in the organization really care about science and evidence-informed decision-making. We're really also interested in working within the science policy interface. So this is a really important way for us to build skills that we're not going to get from traditional academia, especially within the sciences. And we want to make a real difference within our communities. We're passionate about using evidence-informed decision-making and science in decision-making. And so that really translates to our making a difference within the community. And we want to become better informed citizens and better informed about science policy issues and how this system works. But the question Rachel posed to us, or posed to me at the very beginning, was what are the challenges involved with being a student group? So as a student group, we have a lot of turnover in some cases as students graduate, as students move on to other projects or other focuses. So we want to continue to maintain momentum, continue building, not become stagnant. And so part of that is also continuity, and passing on that knowledge between teams. And we want to make sure that we are continuing to support the next generation that comes after us and encourage them to continue to participate in science policy. And one of the other things being a student group is finding support and time for events and activities. Some cases, as a student group, we're actually quite fortunate that we have access to university funds. In some cases, we can apply to different departments, request money to support professional development initiatives, which is, I think, a real benefit of being a student group affiliated with a university. But sometimes that can be a challenge, especially booking rooms, navigating certain protocols. And one of those protocols actually is part of the challenge in our leadership. As a University of Toronto student group, our leadership is limited to University of Toronto students. However, we try to kind of break that barrier by forming committees and offering committee leadership positions to students outside of this, the University of Toronto community, to kind of increase participation and be more inclusive as an organization. So with that, I'll hand the mic back to you, Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. That was, I think, a great way to kick off this discussion. And, you know, the statistic around 5 people less than 3 years ago really demonstrates just the critical mass and growing interest that is happening around science policy. So moving right along, our next speaker is going to be Sarah. So d'abord, je vais poser la question en français, but then I am going to repeat the question in English as well. So, en français, Quels sont les obstacles ou défis que vous avez rencontrés dans le cadre de la coordination des activités du comité intersectoriel étudiant? And once more in English. So, what are some of the challenges or obstacles you faced when it comes to managing and coordinating the activities of the Intersectoral Student Committee in Quebec? Vous, Sarah?
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Mon nom est Sarah Bitter. Je représente aussi ici la voix d'une organisation qui a la chance de bénéficier quasiment au quotidien des conseils de membres de la relève. Donc, mon nom est Sarah Bitter. Je suis coordonnatrice du comité intersectoriel étudiant, donc des fonds de recherche du Québec. Alors, les fonds de recherche du Québec, excusez-moi, ici. Les fonds de recherche du Québec, donc, ce sont les organismes subventionnaires de la recherche pour la province de Québec. Il y en a 3. Le Fonds Nature Technologie, qui est dirigé par Janice Bellet, le Fonds Santé, qui est dirigé par Carole Jabet, et le Fonds Société Culture, qui est dirigé par Louise Poisson. Au-dessus de ces 3 fonds de recherche-là, il y a le scientifique en chef du Québec, Rémi Quirion, que vous connaissez certainement, qui dirige la bannière commune et les services partagés des 3 fonds de recherche du Québec. Excusez-moi pour ça. La mission commune des fonds de recherche, c'est de supporter et de promouvoir l'excellence de la recherche, la formation de la relève, afin de stimuler le développement de connaissances et l'innovation au Québec. Les fonds de recherche du Québec, ce sont 3 entités différentes, donc qui ont 3 conseils d'administration. Chaque fonds a donc son propre conseil d'administration et 4 comités statutaires. Le comité intersectoriel étudiant fait exception. C'est le seul comité statutaire des fonds de recherche du Québec qui est commun aux 3 fonds. Son nom l'indique, c'est un comité intersectoriel, donc il représente les 3 secteurs. La voix de la relève au sein des fonds de recherche du Québec, elle n'est pas seulement au travers du comité intersectoriel étudiant. On retrouve des membres de la relève au sein de nos conseils d'administration. Ces membres-là sont nommés par le gouvernement au même titre que les autres membres du conseil d'administration. Ils ont donc les mêmes droits, comme le droit de vote, et les mêmes devoirs. On a également des membres de la relève sur nos 3 comités des programmes et sur nos 3 comités sur l'éthique et l'intégrité scientifique. Donc, le comité intersectoriel étudiant est composé minimalement de 9 personnes, parce que ces 9 sièges-là que vous voyez représentés à l'écran avec des étoiles, ces 9 sièges-là sont occupés par 9 personnes différentes. Alors, le comité intersectoriel étudiant, mais qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est un comité qui a été créé en 2014 à l'initiative du scientifique en chef du Québec, qui souhaitait s'adjoindre à un comité aviseur de la relève pour le conseiller sur les enjeux qui touchent la relève, donc étudiante et postdoctorale. En 2018, il y a eu une évolution du statut du comité intersectoriel étudiant. Ce comité a été inscrit de manière officielle dans le règlement de régie interne des 3 conseils d'administration des fonds de recherche du Québec. Et grâce à ce changement de statut, en fait, le comité intersectoriel étudiant est devenu périn sur la durée. Le mandat du comité, depuis 2018, c'est plus seulement d'aviser le scientifique en chef du Québec, mais c'est aussi de conseiller les 3 conseils d'administration des fonds de recherche du Québec sur tous les enjeux qui touchent la relève. Pour guider ces actions, le comité intersectoriel étudiant s'est doté d'un plan stratégique qui est calqué en fait sur le plan stratégique des fonds de recherche du Québec pour avoir l'impact le plus grand possible et le plus stratégique dans le choix des dossiers. La planification stratégique actuelle, elle couvrait la période 2020-2022. Il y avait 11 objectifs stratégiques et 3 orientations. À l'hiver 2022, le comité intersectoriel étudiant va retravailler sa planification stratégique parce que les fonds de recherche, justement, mettent à jour leur propre planification. Et donc, le prochain plan stratégique du comité intersectoriel étudiant couvrira la période 2022-2025. Alors, la voix de la relève se fait entendre à plusieurs niveaux au sein des fonds de recherche du Québec. Je l'ai dit au travers du conseil d'administration et des 2 comités statutaires que sont les comités des programmes et les comités sur l'éthique et l'intégrité scientifique. Mais également, le comité intersectoriel étudiant est régulièrement invité à des comités ad hoc sur des thématiques particulières, par exemple l'équité, la diversité et l'inclusion. Le comité intersectoriel étudiant pourrait également être invité dans des équipes de travail à l'interne, comme par exemple l'année dernière, les fonds de recherche du Québec ont décidé de réviser leur grille d'évaluation des programmes de maîtrise, doctorat, postdoctorat, et le comité intersectoriel étudiant a été invité à venir faire des recommandations sur ces nouvelles grilles et partager leur point de vue sur la question. Ici, à l'écran, j'ai mis quelques initiatives des fonds de recherche du Québec qui découlent directement de recommandations du comité intersectoriel étudiant. Je ne les lirai pas toutes, mais vu l'audience qu'on a aujourd'hui, je présenterai peut-être la dernière, qui est la création d'un programme de scientifiques en résidence dans les délégations du Québec à l'étranger. Ça, c'était une recommandation du comité intersectoriel étudiant qui a vu le jour il y a quelques années. Au départ, c'était les délégations de Munich et de Londres qui étaient concernées. Le programme pourrait être étendu à d'autres délégations au cours des prochaines années. Je suis passée vite sur la diapositive précédente parce que je voulais me concentrer sur celle-ci, qui est les défis, et ça va répondre à la question que Rachel m'a posée. Évidemment, les membres du comité intersectoriel étudiant et moi-même vivent un certain nombre de défis au quotidien. D'abord, c'est la structure de gouvernance complexe des fonds de recherche du Québec qui peut parfois être difficile à intégrer pour les nouveaux membres. L'idée, c'est d'avoir un cheminement de dossier qui soit le plus efficace possible, qui permette d'atteindre les objectifs stratégiques du comité intersectoriel étudiant. Donc, comprendre la structure de gouvernance des fonds de recherche, savoir à qui s'adresser, c'est extrêmement important. Pour ça, les fonds de recherche du Québec ont mis sur pied mon rôle, donc la coordination du comité intersectoriel étudiant. C'est une tâche qui est assignée à un membre du personnel des fonds de recherche du Québec pour accompagner les membres du comité tout au long de l'année dans leur dossier et dans le cheminement de leur dossier. Donc moi, mon rôle, c'est vraiment d'aider les membres du comité à évoluer au travers la gouvernance des fonds de recherche du Québec. Également, un point important, c'est que le comité intersectoriel étudiant fait donc partie de la gouvernance des fonds de recherche. Donc, il y a vraiment une distinction à faire entre la recommandation et la revendication. Les membres du comité intersectoriel étudiant sont là pour conseiller les fonds de recherche et pas pour faire des revendications. Ça vient rejoindre un peu le point suivant, faire la différence entre une recommandation de niveau stratégique et une recommandation de niveau opérationnel. En tant que comité d'un conseil d'administration, le comité intersectoriel étudiant doit faire des propositions de stratégie. Il doit suggérer des objectifs à atteindre, mais les moyens à mettre en œuvre pour atteindre ces objectifs-là, atteindre ce résultat, ça relève vraiment de l'opérationnalisation, donc des fonds de recherche du Québec. Donc, pour les membres du comité, ça peut parfois être difficile de faire la distinction entre gouvernance et gestion. Finalement, le dernier gros défi, et ça, moi-même, je le vis au quotidien, c'est la mémoire organisationnelle. Avec un comité qui est composé actuellement d'une quinzaine de personnes, on a 7 personnes qui vont être intégrées dans les prochaines semaines. Ça fait beaucoup de monde, donc beaucoup de suivi à faire, quand les personnes partent, il y a peut-être les bons coups qui peuvent se perdre. Donc, le comité intersectoriel étudiant a décidé de faire de la mémoire organisationnelle un dossier à part entière pour être capable de prendre en note et de conserver dans la durée les bons coups, la bonne manière de faire cheminer les dossiers et aussi de retenir les choses qui ont moins bien marché pour se préparer à l'avenir. Ce que je peux peut-être ajouter au niveau des solutions, donc il y a effectivement mon rôle de coordonnatrice du comité intersectoriel étudiant, mais quand on intègre les nouvelles recrues au sein du comité, on a également un guide d'intégration qui est sous forme de questions-réponses, qui contient pas mal de choses qui peuvent les aider à bien s'intégrer dans le comité. Et également, on leur fait rencontrer la directrice des affaires éthiques et juridiques et la directrice générale pour les familiariser justement avec les processus internes et les meilleurs moyens de venir influencer les politiques des fonds de recherche du Québec. Donc, ça fait le tour pour ma présentation. Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Merci, Sarah. Thank you. That was really interesting. I think it's useful actually to sort of give that overview of the governance of research funds in Quebec, because I expect many people on this panel today aren't familiar with some of these structures, and not only the structures that exist in Quebec, but I think it's actually very common that governance structures are actually very hard to grasp from the outside when we're looking at them, and they tend to feel very heavy and large and impenetrable. So thanks so much for that, Sarah. And for highlighting that, that the intersectoral student committee has had a very real, very tangible influence on the work of research in Quebec. So thank you. Moving on, who do we have next? Next on the list here is Sean McGurk. So Sean, I'm so pleased to introduce Sean. Sean and I have known each other for a few years now and actually have worked together at the Science and Policy Exchange. So the question I want to punt over to you today, Sean, is about the Science and Policy Exchange, SPE for short. So the Science and Policy Exchange is celebrating their 10-year anniversary this year. Hard to believe. As a longstanding director and former president, can you share some reflections on the challenges involved in sustaining and building an organization like SPE?
Thanks, Rachel. Very glad to do it. Will say, although the little Chiron under my name says NSERC, I'm here representing Science and Policy Exchange. Je veux dire aussi très rapidement par rapport à l'ACFAS, que je représente aussi, qui ont un excellent comité de la relève, des comités pour la francophonie internationale, la francophonie canadienne, et qui s'engagent aussi beaucoup dans la politique scientifique. Donc, pour ceux qui s'identifient dans la francophonie canadienne, je vous recommande fortement de vous engager avec l'ACFAS. Donc, je vais laisser ça un peu de côté pour revenir à tout ce qui a rapport avec Science Policy Exchange. So, given that I've just kind of taken that time, I won't introduce myself much more than that, but I'll go directly into SPE. So as Rachel mentioned, SPE has been around for actually over 10 years at this point. I've been involved with the group since 2013, which it seems like a long time now. I will, and sorry if you don't want to be called out, but I'll specifically call out Anne No, who is attending the session and who is the founder of SPE. So I'm very glad, Anne, you're able to make it. And I wanted to give you a special call out since it's really kind of from you that I'm able to be on this panel. And in large part that I have the career that I have at this point. So there's quite a long list of folks that have been involved in bringing SPE up to the point that it is. So SPE provides an open and accessible platform for the next generation of scientists and researchers. And that definition being really as inclusive as anyone wants to take it for themselves, to exchange ideas and perspectives, develop their network and skills, and to explore new solutions at the interface of science, society, and policy. So that's really by supporting capacity building for them, producing and disseminating resources that are created by the next generation and for the next generation, and then by engaging stakeholders and right holders in science, policy, and society to amplify and promote the inclusion of their voices. I'll note SPE is also now on Instagram, so you can pretty easily find them there, in addition to all of these great other areas here, including on the website. So I won't go kind of too in detail on this slide. Really, it's here to just show how much has been done up to this point. But yeah, SPE came up really through and because of CSPC, which kind of really started a movement towards science policy in Canada. SPE pretty quickly became a nonprofit organization and was really built somewhat on the model of CSPC to really bring the student voice into an annual conference about science policy. So SPE ran with that model for several years. But to the question that Rachel posed, it was quickly became evident that that was not sustainable in the long term. Attendance was, although it was, I would say the questions that are being asked, the students that are participating, there's a lot of returning people every year. The questions became a lot more pointed. It almost became much more productive in terms of discussion over time. But the audience kind of shrunk over time, because there's only so much you can do contained in one area. So we reflected on how to expand this and how to keep SPE going, and really kind of broke up the mandate of SPE from doing an annual conference to really doing some more targeted work, more consultation type work, while still doing some more kind of public forum style outreach on science policy. And through building up the board, getting experts like Paul Dufour, which I'm sure most, if not everyone attending CSPC should know, as well as Rachel, Nicole Arbour, folks from the Fonds de Recherche du Québec. Quite a few people have cycled through the board over the last few years, and including a series of past presidents of SPE, including myself, having been a president from 2016 to 2017, co-president in 2017-18 with Vanessa Sung. We have a consistent number of ex-presidents that stay on as internal board members to help guide the new team that comes in every year. So I'll kind of move on quickly from this, but all this to say, SP has really gone through a lot of different stages over time. And we've really come to the point now that SP has turned 10, that we've developed a new strategic plan through quite a bit of directed consultation, quite a diverse group of people engaged in putting this together within SPE itself. It does say 2021, 2026. The plan is not out yet, but hopefully by the end of the year. If not, this may become a 2022-27 plan. But it has 5 main goals, which are both about SP, but also about the science policy community more generally. So SP wants to keep providing that platform, keep providing resources, and to keep capacity building, and to represent the voice of the next generation. All that continues. But there is an emphasis on the long-term sustainability of SPE as an organization on its own, but also the sustainability of the national capacity for science policy, and that kind of extends to all the groups that are here, to CSPC and a lot of other initiatives that are run in large part through volunteers. And it's quite important to reflect on how to maintain these, because the momentum it's really built on kind of the will to continue by all the folks that are involved. And I think beholden to that is to uphold and promote not just equity, diversity, and inclusion, but also accessibility within the science policy landscape. And this is something we're reflecting on within SP itself as well, in terms of making sure that the leadership of SP is representative of all Canadians and of the science policy community at large. So I wanted to just kind of go through a few slides just showing some of the impact that SP has had. One of which, and having been an organization that's been around for 10 years now, I would almost say 11 years, SP has been able to kind of keep the conversation going on quite a few important topics. One of them being the PhD itself, being that it is generally PhD students and postdocs that are members of SPE, all the way back in 2013 up to 2015 and 16, and even recently in this year, keeping the conversation going on what the PhD itself is, what the purpose of the doctorate is, and how we can build towards more diverse types of career paths. And kind of central to that in the middle panel is a white paper, which I'll fairly openly say almost crushed SPE, because it was such a massive undertaking that so many of us had taken on for the first time, that all of our time really became dedicated to this one project. And this is one of the things that has made us reflect as well on how SPE can maintain driving really impactful projects while also maintaining itself as an organization and making sure that we're looking ahead and not just at what we're doing currently. SPE also, like TSPN, runs quite a few workshops, highlighting 3 here. One of the largest events we've ever run in 2018, aside from at the same time as the G7, was held in Montreal. a very large symposium on students as stakeholders in science diplomacy with panelists coming from all over the world, smaller workshops on things like science advice, and a recent one that was in partnership with NSERP. So I'm quite proud of that because it kind of fills in all the different hats that I wear on moving forward on EDI and looking at the best practices, bringing in not just the voices of the policymakers that are involved in that, but also students that are involved in driving a lot of that work locally within their universities. And then SP has been involved, of course, with a lot of advocacy. Back in 2015, had done a Vote for Science campaign, interviewing folks like Ted Su, who's participated in CSPC this year, participated in things like the Science March, and then with quite a few of the organizations around the table here, participated in the Vote Science campaigns in 2019 and again this year. And then SPE is probably most known across Canada for some of the more evidence-based advocacy that was done, notably around the Naylor Report, the Fundamental Science Review, into the 2018 budget, through which we actually ended up having discussions, even to the extent with several ministers, being in the budget lockup, and thanking the Prime Minister on behalf of students for the investments that came into the 2018 budget for fundamental research, and a more recent survey on Canadian scholarships and fellowships, which lines up quite well with the really great work that was done by TSPN on looking at the impact of COVID-19 on grad students. And also I'll mention some other great work that's going on now through the Ottawa Science Policy Network and some other groups that are also looking at similar topics. I'd encourage you to look into that. And finally, on advocacy for the inclusion of next generation voices in science policy generally. And I'm really proud to say that both SPE and the Comité Intersectoriel Étudiant with the FRQ had helped to bring a new science policy kind of young professionals group called, unironically, Science Policy Exchange in New Zealand, under Peter Gluckman back in 2016. And I would like to think also helped to lead to the development of the Youth Advisory Council that's currently working with Dr. Mona Niemer, of which we have one of the excellent members here today on the panel, Taylor Morrisseau. So I'll end it there, and definitely glad to keep talking about the sustainability issues that SP has faced, because there are quite a bit. And glad to have anybody reach out to me for any questions. Back to you, Rachel.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sean. And I mean, wow, I always have a lot of thoughts. And after, hearing sort of the full range, I guess, of topics and events that SB has been able to cover in its, fairly short history, it's really inspiring. And I think it's inspired a lot of the other groups that we're seeing pop up across the country, and like you mentioned in New Zealand, and I just want to emphasize too how SB has now published its first strategic plan, and this is a big deal for an organization, especially for a student organization, having a strategic plan, going through that exercise. And I know how much you reached out into the community to get feedback into that plan. It's like, you'd be really proud. I think SB should be really proud of that effort. And it shows, just how far the organization has come in its 11 years. You have a strategic plan. It's very exciting. Okay, so thanks, Sean. And so next on the list here is Taylor. So I'm really excited to hear from Taylor today. I mentioned a few things about her opening in my opening remarks, but I am going to also pose a specific question to Taylor to address as she tells us a little bit more about her work. So Taylor, you are currently serving in a number of roles, including on Canada's Chief Science Advisor's inaugural Youth Council. I always find that a mouthful. And you are the only trainee on the advisory board for the CIHR Institute for Human Development, Child and Youth Health. So I'm really curious to hear how you navigate these new spaces and what some of the challenges that challenges are that you've encountered as a result. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you, Sean, for kind of leading into the work that the CSA has done, thanks to the work of SPE and others in the past. And of course, that question is a really good question. I'll start by telling you that my name's Taylor Morso, and I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at the University of Manitoba. I'm also an Indigenous scholar, so a lot of the work that I do and the representation that I have on these councils is from not only a next generation, but also an Indigenous perspective. And my research is in the area of type 2 diabetes in Indigenous health, trying to really integrate basic science and Indigenous knowledge in pursuit of culturally safe therapeutic strategies. So the academic work that I do, as I mentioned, is through these organizations. But because of the work that I do and the need and recognizing that Indigenous health inequities are not simply needing more research, but often resulting from a lack of political will, I had to kind of join a lot of different policy interest groups in order to advise on issues that I'm gaining expertise in. So today I advise on boards for Research Canada, CIHR ITSE, as was mentioned, as one of the only trainees, I think, on all institute advisory boards at CIHR. Which is a problem, as well as the Native Biodata Consortium in the States, and of course the Chief Science Advisor's inaugural Youth Council. It is a mouthful. So I hope to address that question of how to navigate these different spaces, multiple spaces, and highlighting the need to really synergize our efforts across these various platforms. But to focus in on the CSA for the purpose of this presentation, the Chief Science Advisor's Youth Council was established in March 2020, so right at the start of the pandemic. And our mandate really includes the following. One is to provide a youth perspective to the work of Dr. Mona Niemer. Two, to bring attention to the issues that we face as youth in our communities. Third, to think broadly about key challenges facing the entire science community, and really to think about and envision a future for science in Canada. And four, to take part or lead outreach activities on behalf of the CSA, such as our CSPC roundtables last year, which were done virtually. And that also helps to inform our work and our larger projects. So the CSA-YC was established with 20 young scientists to start. And so we're quite new, but we include undergraduate, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, early career faculty members, recent graduates, and industry professionals. So as you can see, the first kind of number of members here, our expertise cut across a wide number of different scientific disciplines. So that's the first half of our members, and this is the second half. So one thing I want to mention, though, although we are a larger council sitting at 20 members, 1,115 applications were actually received during the first call for this youth council. And I think that this number alone should really make us all stop and think about the demand for science policy opportunities in Canadian youth and the need to create more inroads for these voices to be heard. So our council focuses our efforts in three main areas. The first is community engagement through avenues like the panel discussion today. Secondly is to advise the Office of the CSA, it's a mouthful, Office of the Chief Science Advisor, by leveraging our expertise to inform their ongoing work, as well as participating in national discussions, especially amid the pandemic, where we've collaborated with other groups like the TSPN, and to really amplify that message surrounding the impacts of COVID-19 on students. Lastly, we work with the OCSA to really develop our own priorities, such as this roadmap for science that we're working on currently, writing from a next generation perspective. So just to highlight some of the strengths of the YC in particular, not to say that other councils on this call, everyone has their own unique strengths, but I think one of our unique items is that we are inherently more sustainable, is simply because we are paired with an official office. And so we have a designated point of contact with the CSA, and that really lends itself to being a sustaining youth council where the council is constant, but our members may be a little bit more transient, which is really important to think about when trying to engage youth as a more transient demographic. With the foresight, we have this generational diversity, so we bring fresh perspectives to these long-term forward-thinking goals. Thirdly, members themselves gain a lot of skills in science policy, which for many of our members at the start, including myself, was asking the question, what is science policy? You know, we joined the council, but we didn't really know what that meant in practice. And I think this better prepares us to work across disciplines and professions, and of course, growing our network through that process. The last point here is that our council was formed at the start of the pandemic, meaning we have never actually met face to face, which is a really interesting dynamic that we all had to work through. But I think the ability to work virtually and doing that effectively using the tools that are available now because of the needs, and often that is asynchronous, and that is really amenable to youth who often have competing priorities and have less flexible schedules. But of course, all strengths come with a few challenges, and so one of which we've encountered is in part due to the speed of the pandemic that science advice happens really quickly. And so integrating 20 different perspectives from across the country into something that is actually usable for the CSA really does take time. And often we're asking ourselves, when we complete a project, is it still relevant? Is it still useful? Or do we need to move on to the next thing? Second and third, that our focus and our reach are quite limited to our own spheres of influence, and which are inherently based within the sciences or within other policy involved groups. I think today is a really great example on how we can all come together, but we need to formalize mechanisms for collaboration, and not only to avoid duplicating efforts, but really to amplify that common message coming from our next gen. As I mentioned, I sit on many of these different boards and advisory committees, often saying the same thing over and over again. So more people saying the same thing across the country will undoubtedly lead to change. And I know we're going to dig into some of the recommendations a little bit more in our panel discussion, but I think a few of the lessons that we have learned, including having that dedicated point person within an organization to really allow for a rapid response as events unfold. Our members are experts in their own rights, and having that point person and having open channels of communication allow us to appoint members who can really speak to the issues at hand without having to go through the process of convening everybody and having a full meeting. Secondly, I think in this era of science advice, something that we have learned is that we need to look beyond our limited definition of what constitutes a scientist, both in the representation of our council as well as in our broad consultation strategies, really to have better representation of not only expertise in the humanities, social sciences, but also of lived experiences and identities. Lastly, the need to collaborate with other youth councils and really to synergize our efforts nationally and internationally. Because as a personal plea from somebody who is definitely overburdened by providing advice to various councils, I think we need to work better and more collaboratively as a community to support us in finding voices who we can engage and hear in these science policy spaces. And I think we all on this call, actually, Sean, the first time I met Sean was because he brought me into a conversation with Research Canada, which has led to great connections there. So it's about leveraging our personal networks and bringing people into these spaces where their voices can also be heard. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Jose, for the opportunity to share a little bit about the Chief Science Advisors Youth Council, and I really look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I wrote down a few things there. That number of applicants to the Youth Council is incredible. And while I'm sure we would love to have all of them on the council, it really does speak to like Shivani had sort of opened with the demand that exists. The students that are in our post-secondary institutions are hungry for these experiences. So that number actually makes me quite glad. But I also wrote down here, science advice happens quickly, but integrating perspectives takes time. These are words to live by if you are interested in coming into the world of policy. Great, so thank you. And so moving on to our final speaker in this lineup today is Uzma. So we're going to hear a little bit about Uzma's trajectory. And of course, I have a specific question for her as well. So as many of you already know, there are many trainees and early career researchers who volunteer behind the scenes at the Canadian Science Policy Centre. So my my specific question for you to address in your remarks, Uzma, is what are some of the challenges involved in coordinating such a large base of volunteers?
Hi, everyone. Are you able to see my screen? Are you able to see my screen? Awesome. Okay, just wanted to confirm before I began. Well, first, thank you, Rachel, and hello, everyone, on this last day of CSPC 2021. Let me just start off by saying that it's my absolute pleasure to be here with fellow panelists and colleagues who I work with day in and day out. So it just doesn't feel like I'm in an alien space, even when it's all virtual. In terms of my introduction, as Rachel mentioned, my name is Uzma Uruj. I work in the federal government at ISED as a senior policy advisor on STI priorities, research governance, overall policy development, mostly related to granting agencies, the CFR, the CIHR, the SHIRC, and CERC, to ensure that science and research can be leveraged for the Canadian science society and its economy. But I'm here to represent the Canadian Science Policy Center, which is the other hat that I tend to wear. So I'll just kind of start off with a little bit about how I got involved with CSPC. I joined the CSPC back in 2016 when I moved back to Canada after having spent several years in the UK research ecosystem. At the time, I was looking for a platform that will help me understand the science and research landscape in Canada, which had obviously changed a lot since I had left the country to do my PhD. And joining the CSPC was an intentional effort to understand Canada-specific science policy issues, dialogues, and discussions, and almost to re-embed myself back into the Canadian research ecosystem. Over the past many years, I've led symposiums on science diplomacy, an aspect of science policy that I am passionate about. I've chaired the program committee, set up budget sessions and events, participated in career campuses, mentoring activities, and also initiated the evaluation and reports committee to help CSPC gather and evaluate the feedback that you all provide to us through various surveys and other methods so we can continue to deliver as you expect us to. I've been chairing the Evaluation and Reports Committee since its inception over 2 years ago. Personally, through CSPC, I've broadened my horizons, expanded my professional network, given back to the community through mentoring, and also gained a nuanced understanding of the Canadian science policy landscape. And I'm not the only one. There are so many of us who have benefited from this platform. That is the brainchild of Mehrdad Hariri, the CEO and president of Canadian Science Policy Center. I remember once I asked Mehrdad how he came across the idea of starting this non-profit, non-partisan, non-advocacy organization over 13 years ago. And he pointed me to this article that he and Jeff Jerome penned together for the University Affairs. And at that time, for 2009, that article was the most read article for that entire year. So back in 2009, when Mehrdad was a postdoc and Jeff was a doctoral student, they both noticed a gap in the Canadian research and innovation ecosystem, that there was no platform that facilitated the exchange of ideas among researchers, policymakers, universities, industries, and governments, and that there were no formal channel for the academic science community to proactively communicate their concerns to policymakers, and vice versa. So for policymakers to receive that external independent science advice beyond what could be provided at the time through STIC, the Science, Technology, and Innovation Councils, and the Council of Canadian Academies that exists still today. And so CSPC was created with a vision to build a strong, inclusive, and effective science policy community that contributes to the well-being of Canadians, and a mission. And the mission was to achieve the 4 Cs: to connect, to convene, to capacity build, and to catalyze research through the support of an effective science policy community. Over the years, this platform has expanded leaps and bounds, and you all are witness to that, with new products and connecting opportunities being added pretty much every year. Considering this panel session is specifically discussing the role of grassroots initiatives in supporting and building capacity for science policy in Canada. So I'll highlight few examples of how CSPC has strived to achieve this through its platform, which is one of its missions, the capacity building. So I'll start off with the Career Campus and Meet the Executive series. That takes place throughout the year with the aim to offer lived experiences, tips, and best practices for entering and progressing through careers in science policy. And if you look at the pictures, you'll see some of the culprits showing up again and again. We all obviously belong to the same science policy community. Next, obviously, we have these professional development training workshops that are specifically designed to make the next generation of science policy experts aware of a lot of those topics that we hear about, but learning about the best practices around evidence-based decision making, science communication, equity, diversity, inclusion, and the challenge around it. And then the scientific commercialization, all of those are some of the topics that CSPC through its training workshops offers. But beyond training and mentoring, it is equally important to recognize those who contribute to the field of science policy. And CSPC has been recognizing this talent since 2013. First through youth awards that started back in 2013, but then resumed again in 2016. And more recently through Lifetime Achievement Awards and Trailblazer Awards in Science and Innovation Policy. But I would say that the real triumph of CSPC is how it has attracted, motivated, and maintained a diverse team of over 70 volunteers spread across 7 committees representing various career stages, disciplines, and sectors. So you will see again so many pictures that of people who you have worked with and or at least are aware of. Through these committees, those who have wanted to sample various aspects of science policy can build skills in science communication, program and policy development, grant writing, and overall science promotion. I believe that CSPC volunteers are a true inspiration, and not just because I am involved with it, but the caliber of people that I work with is just totally amazing. And the time and effort that they are able to dedicate, it really shines through, and it also obviously helps them develop their leadership, operational governance, and team building skills along the way. And not to mention the lifelong friendships and connections that one makes by being part of the CSPC family. Of course, there are challenges associated with having a large volunteer-based organization. And going back to your question, Rachel, some of the challenges that CSPC faces include limited resources in terms of being able to coordinate these volunteers. But having said that, I feel like the limited resources has actually propelled CSPC to be highly resourceful. So for example, long before COVID, when the entire world pivoted to virtual meetings, CSPC was using virtual platforms for meetings and coordinations for all of its activities because our volunteers are spread all across Canada and outside Canada. So it was relatively easy for CSPCs to pivot to virtual setting, which meant that we had already ironed out many challenges around coordination, timing, and resource sharing in a virtual setting. Interestingly, turnover hasn't been much of an issue. Of course, we have volunteer turnover, which all organizations, especially the grassroots organizations or student-led organizations, tend to have. But a lot of us have stayed on as well. And I think to Mehrdad's leadership, which is a huge plus that we have a consistent and a constant leadership in someone like Mehrdad, who's dedicated to this platform, but also to the concept of science policy in Canada. So even now, CSPC volunteers take it upon themselves in coming up with ingenious ideas that I always say that they are resource light, but concept heavy. And I think that's where the niche of CSPC is. The best part, CSPC's current and past volunteers haven't just made a difference through the CSPC platform alone. Many of them have engaged with CSPC, but they have gone on to initiate science policy forums in their own jurisdictions, sectors, and networks. This platform has certainly inspired many, and we take pride in the fact that at CSPC, we started those dialogues and we initiated that dialogue that empowered so many. So Sean mentioned about how CSPC Science Policy Exchange, the idea and the networking began at one of the CSPC conferences. I think I saw Sarah Laframboise in the room. She's the current co-chair of the editorial committee, but she has also started the Ottawa Student Science Policy Network, I think just this year. Shivani, who's the other panelist here with me today. She was a previous volunteer at CSPC and went on to co-found the Toronto Science Policy Network. And Rebecca Rubin, who's a volunteer member of the Evaluation and Reports Committee that I lead. She's also the executive at large of the Toronto Student Network. These are just the 3 examples that come to my mind pretty much right away, or actually 4 examples, but there are so many of us who have benefited. In fact, so many of the previous and past volunteers have used, but also leveraged CSPC as a gateway for a career in science policy. You must have seen the article published in this year's CSPC magazine of Shweta Garapati, who co-leads the Evaluation and Reports Committee alongside me, about her journey into a career in science policy, all due to her involvement with the CSPC. So I think that really, to me, is the standout point of what CSPC has achieved over the years. Anyway, moving on, I will quickly highlight a few other products that CSPC is proud to have launched in the last many years with the intention to catalyze the science policy related evidence base and discussion. So one of them is the repository of editorials from emerging and established thought leaders on a variety of topics, all of which are freely available at the CSPC website. So please check them out. Here's a shameless plug for myself as well for my editorial, so do check it out. And in the same vein, the annual Science Policy magazine that I talked about earlier, its 3rd Science Policy edition is also out. And I know that Sean and Rachel and Shivani, they have their editorials in there as well. So have a look at it. It's amazing how those journeys have begun from these platforms. And another event that CSPC tends to run with the Office of the Chief Science Advisor and is the Science Meets Parliament that facilitates the meeting of the researchers with the members of the Parliament. And of course, there is the CSPC Annual Conference, which has emerged as a key science policy conference in Canada over the years, with representation from the ministers, the Governor General, and Nobel Prize laureates, in addition to policymakers, trainees, and scientists from all sectors. What you are attending today is the 13th annual conference. It's held virtually, obviously, for the past 2 years due to COVID. But otherwise, in normal times, this conference is traditionally held in Ottawa. But prior to that, this conference was also held in Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Halifax. And since 2015, due to the feedback that we received from the conference attendees, it was decided to hold the annual conference permanently in Ottawa. So I want to end by sharing with you a glimpse of CSPC's achievements in year 2020 alone, where our dedicated team of volunteers have delivered 17 webinars, 5 workshops, in addition to this annual conference that you are attending today. And back in March 2020, when COVID hit us all, we worked tirelessly to rapidly share with you all a repository of 75 plus COVID-specific reliable resources and 60 plus opinion articles and editorials on COVID-related policy aspects. And just to give you a quick idea of our conference demographics, it's a conference that's attended by people from all key sectors, career stages, and gender. And our early numbers for this year's conference match similar multi-sectoral representation. The numbers I have over here are for last year's conference. That's why we strongly believe that CSPC is more than just a conference. We believe that it is a festival of science policy. And I strongly encourage all of you to consider joining us in whatever capacity you have and whatever capacity you can manage, be it volunteering on one of the committees, writing editorials or opinion articles, attending our events, career campuses, budget sessions, or simply to have fun. I think I'll stop here. I hope you have enjoyed this year's conference, and we hope to see you all in person next year. And in the meanwhile, I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thanks so much, Usman. I'm just smiling because it's a very meta way to conclude the conference by CSPC talking about CSPC, talking about future CSPC, talking about CSPC volunteers. So super fun. And I wrote down one of your comments around sort of getting involved with CSPC as a way to sort of reinvent yourself back into policy when you came back to Canada, and I thought that was an interesting reflection, because you emphasize throughout, and many of the others have as well, the importance of just getting into the network, so to say, getting the mainframe of science policy in Canada. And once you're in there, and you can sort of connect through the whole system. So thanks so much for that. So we take the time here. So we have so I just want to remind everybody to, if you have questions that you want to ask our speakers, to please drop them in the Q&A or the discussion forum. I will look at both. But I thought maybe just before we were talking questions, that I would pose one, maybe two, if I have time, questions to the group, and answer. But and many of you have touched on some of this, but I want to talk a little bit. I think, as emphasized throughout, is these are grassroots volunteer organizations, and it's absolutely incredible what these organizations are able to pull off, like a real punch. But and they're certainly filling a critical gap, but they don't have the capacity to engage this number. This is the thing that keeps coming up, this growing number of science policy leaders. So how over 1,000 applicants, chief science advisor, get in science policy, and we continue to build capacity for the next generation in science policy throughout the country. I don't know if anyone wants to take that off the bat. Anyone? Shivani, Taylor, Sean, anybody? I'll be very polite.
Who wants to start?
Yeah,
I can. Sure. I'll offer a few words, and I think, I'm not going to say anything like incredibly profound here, but I do think that we need additional touch points for expertise development that are short-term and accessible. In your introduction from myself, you mentioned the Summer Institute for Indigenous Peoples and Genomics, and really something that we should all notice is that is called an internship. That was a 1-week program that really delved into policy engagement and ethics around genomics, but it was an internship that went on my CV that looked very profound, but was it was a 1-week intensive thing that wasn't a long-term commitment, but it really gave me the vocabulary, and it sparked an interest to develop that further if I wanted to, but at the same time required 0 long-term commitment. So there's one potential opportunity, making internships, not workshops, not training courses, but real opportunities that go on people's CVs.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Taylor. And apparently my connection was a little bit spotty. Repeat so we're looking to how do we capture how do we engage this growing demand? How do we build capacity for the next gen? Who else wants to respond? Sean?
Sean, you're muted.
Ah.
No, wait.
No, I'm not. Weird.
My connection's
not. Where was I? Yeah, jumping off what Taylor was saying. I think we really need to kind of have a way to codify the activities that are done by folks that are working, during their training, during their PhD, during a postdoc or whatnot, and they're doing activities in science policy. I think that needs to be valued as something that is, something positive that they're working on. They need to be supported and have the time to do it, but also, if they're participating in putting together a workshop, if they're participating in, writing grants about science policy, if they're participating in, putting together consultations or participating in consultations, I think making sure that their names are recognized and that there is a clear indication that they are taking initiative and that they can show that they have done these things, I think is very important in terms of showing your progress in science policy. Because the reality is there's not too much formal training in science policy. A lot of it kind of happens kind of in the fringes. I mentioned this at the EDI symposium earlier last week, that there was a great small study that was done by a AAAS S&T fellow I think maybe before she became a fellow, at the Harvard Citizenship Initiative, which looked at where PhD holders working in science policy, where they got their skills that they use in their science policy careers. And for the most part, except for like discipline specific expertise and maybe data analysis, it was entirely extracurricular, or for the most part extracurricular. So there's a lot of hidden knowledge in science policy, and it's a lot about who you know and how much time you have to go out and get the skills and the experience and those bits that you can add to your CV to show that you've taken that initiative. So the more accessible those initiatives are, the more easily it is to be recognized for having done them. But then also just not having all of this be a black box, having it that you can just, you want to get involved, you click on a button and you find out how you can. Click on a second button and you do.
Shivani, yeah. And Shivani and then Uzma after. Thanks, Sean.
Sure. I like echoing what both Taylor and Sean said, that is actually kind of the motivation of TSPN, right? We started TSPN because we didn't have a way to learn about it. We had attended CSPC. A lot of us had attended at least one CSPC conference. So it was a good introduction. And there were symposiums at the time about Science Policy 101. So those were really good starting points for us. But as students as well, thinking about kind of, we couldn't necessarily take off a week to go to CSPC. That was kind of a privilege for some of us to be able to do that, especially in your graduate education, to say, I'm going to a conference that is not related to my research at all, and paying for your own trip, paying for your conference registration fee. So thinking about kind of, there's these unseen barriers in a sense too for students and NGRs interested in getting into these spaces. And so having these workshops that OSPN is now also putting together, CSPC has started this great career series, SPE has these workshops as well, and having those opportunities to actually learn about science policy from different perspectives, it is really, really important in supporting those initiatives. Oftentimes, I think we're a large group of students who are next generation researchers, not just students interested in science policy, but we've gotten to a point where we're almost in an echo chamber in our own. We bring in, occasionally we have new folks coming in sometimes, but we need to really expand because there are people who are interested in this and getting our word out to them, not just those who are attending CSPC, because I think most people who find CSPC are people who are like, they know they're interested in science policy. So, but there are people out there who are probably going to be interested in science policy, or probably going to be quite passionate about some of the issues that we are really interested in at CSPC and within our respective organizations, but bringing them in and like kind of expanding our sphere a little bit more and being more inclusive, I think is really important, and probably like one of the bigger next steps of this entire community, I would think.
Thanks, Shivani. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think Uzma has something to add to you.
Yes. So while I totally agree with all the points that have been raised so far, I think we are missing the bigger picture here with the fact that if we are serious about building the capacity at a national level, then we need to start thinking about allocating resources to the organizations, like all of those that we, that are represented here, but there are so many others as well, and start to build their capacity to do these things in a systematic manner. So they are not necessarily dependent on that one leader who started the organization, and then once he or she or they graduate that place, cannot find the next leader, or doesn't have the money or the network or the resources to continue forward. We've got to be a little bit more systematic about it. That requires obviously the motivation and will, not just from the provincial and the local governments, but also I think the universities need to step up and start thinking about supporting some of these student-led organizations that have actually originated and actually bringing so much a good positive vibe and good promotion to their your organizations, to start actually owning them up through some support, financial.
I couldn't agree more. I had a prompt here around sort of what about the other side? What about administrators, universities, et cetera? But you've touched on that here, so I'm not going to go into that. I also just want to say, you may have noticed that our friend Sarah has also dropped off. I think she's having just a connection issue, but hopefully she will be able to join us before the end of this session. There is a question for her in here in the Q&A. But we'll give her a couple minutes to see if she comes, if she's able to get back in. In the meantime, I'll just maybe throw another prompt out there. It's very likely that there are many trainees or early career researchers tuning into this session today. So maybe we'll just do a little tour de table with each of you sharing what advice do you have for someone interested in exploring the world of science policy? How can they get started and potentially build it into a trajectory? And many of you have touched on it sort of in your remarks, but sort of what's your just one piece of advice, if you could give one brief thing. I see Sean laughing like he's not going to be able to do that, so we won't start with him. Why don't we start with anyone else? Anyone, do you want to jump in on that? Shwani?
Yeah, I can jump in and start. I think just get involved and get engaged with one of the organizations here. I think, and I know people in TSPN who are also involved with SPE, also involved with CSPC. Uzma gave a great example. Rebecca, one of the current executives on the TSPN leadership, is also a CSPC volunteer. So there's no restriction. There's no reason why you can't join multiple groups if you're interested in a lot of these groups, or just join one and get really involved into one organization. And I think we're gonna check out the science we made a little bit of an announcement in the Science Policy magazine about some new initiative that all our teams are kind of working collaboratively on. Well, I think Sean will touch on this and announce it a little later, but hinting at something that is an opportunity that's coming up. And I also want to flag TSPN is preparing for a number of back to basics. I'm going to series of workshops, which I'm really excited for the new team to put together. They're really putting something amazing together, and that's going to be coming up. And that's a really good gateway for if you know someone who's kind of interested in science policy, doesn't know what it is. It's a really good opportunity to kind of learn about what that space is like.
Thank you. That's great. Uzma, was that a hand?
Yes, it was. Before Sean jumps in with his plentiful advice, because I'm sure he has more than one. So just echoing, definitely getting involved with some of these grassroots organizations is always useful, helpful. Attending these career campuses really makes a difference. There are so many different ways to get involved and organize, and get the flavor of it all now than probably 5 years ago. But it still is a relatively new field, which means that there's still a lot of opportunity to create your own mark by creating something. Like the example of everyone who's sitting here in this panel today, they all created their own path and carved their own way for their careers, but also for others. So I think that's also an opportunity here, considering how relatively new this entire field is. But I'd also like to add that don't hesitate to reach out to other science policy practitioners just to get some mentoring advice, but also to build your network. I think that a lot of time we are just a bit reluctant and hesitant to do that, but that pays off a lot.
Thanks so much, Usman. And I really, what you said really resonates with me. I mean, people ask me all the time how I got to where I am, and it was all very random, to be perfectly honest. But what I did do was I just took opportunities that were in front of me, and just kept moving. So I see Sarah has rejoined us. Welcome back. But I think, Sean, are you able to quickly give your advice before we move on?
Yeah, I'll say that because Shivani already mentioned kind of the bigger one is just get involved with one of these groups. I mean, this is what it's all about, or start your own. But I think really the big thing is, when you're starting out in this, and I'd say frankly even now, you're not going to know everything about science policy from the start. I still don't know the extent of what's considered science policy. It's a very kind of nebulous thing. There's a lot of definitions that aren't super clear. There's a lot of topics. You can really, any discussion that kind of intersects science and society has a policy component. Anything that intersects with the science and policy component probably has a societal component. All of this is linked. One of the first big things that I did in science policy was I attended a seminar at McGill that was put on by my department, where there was a speaker that I thought was brilliant, and I thought I need to get this guy on a panel to talk about something. And what I ended up doing in the end, I ended up applying for a CIHR planning dissemination grant, and literally got a PI grant to set up a public forum to get people talking about genetic discrimination and about genetic testing, and to kind of raise more awareness about it back in 2017. And, I've did a little bit of work with kind of genetics genomics in my PhD, but I'm not an expert in the least. But it's something that I thought needed more conversation, and brought a bunch of experts together to the table to talk about it. And I learned just as much as everybody else in that room in that conversation. And I think that's the case for a lot of events that SPE runs. It's people that want to run events to learn themselves. So don't be hesitant to get involved in something and to even organize something if you know nothing about it. If you're interested in it, that's reason enough.
Good advice. Good advice. Thanks, Sean. Taylor, did you want to add final?
Sure. It's quick. Because that really spurred. You're all attending CSPC right now, and you're learning something about science policy right now. And people in your networks that don't know anything about science policy. And so it's worth reaching out to those people and telling them what you learned, so that we can rise all boats. We really need to engage people that aren't part of this conversation right now, to have equity in science policy. And that's something that we're all struggling with. So, I encourage everyone here to really reach out to those people that aren't talking about science policy and start talking about science policy.
Totally. There is one specific, there's a directed question actually for Sarah in here, in our Q&A. And it's about, I think how do students get named or placed on boards or committees, like the committee that you outlined, and how long do they typically serve on these groups? Sarah?
Oui, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Oui, super, merci. J'ai eu des petits problèmes de connexion. Ben oui, c'est une bonne question. Effectivement, le comité intersectoriel étudiant fait à peu près une fois par année un grand recrutement. Alors nous, on n'a pas eu 1700 et quelques candidatures, mais un peu plus de 200. Donc quand même, à l'échelle du Québec, c'est quand même une bonne un bon intérêt qui a été manifesté pour le comité. C'est les membres du comité eux-mêmes qui font le recrutement. Donc, il y a un formulaire à remplir en ligne, puis après ça, des entrevues. Et ensuite, c'est vraiment une nomination officielle par les conseils d'administration, donc les curriculum vitae des étudiants que nous, on a sélectionnés au terme des entrevues sont présentés au conseil d'administration et les conseils d'administration acceptent en fait de nommer ces personnes sur le comité intersectoriel étudiant. Donc, c'est vraiment comme ça que ça se passe. Ça part de la relève qui choisit les étudiants et étudiantes qui vont joindre le comité. Et puis, c'est ça, à peu près une fois par année, on fait ce recrutement-là. Et pour la deuxième question qui était de savoir à combien de temps en fait la personne siège au comité, il n'y a pas de limite de temps. On en a certains qui sont restés 4-5 ans. En fait, la seule exigence que nous avons au sein des fonds de recherche du Québec, c'est que la personne ait un statut d'étudiant. Donc, quelqu'un qui nous rejoindrait, par exemple, à la maîtrise, parce que je ne l'ai pas mentionné tout à l'heure, mais le comité intersectoriel étudiant a des personnes du niveau collégial, baccalauréat, maîtrise, doc et post-doc. Donc, on a vraiment une vision assez large de la relève. Donc, quelqu'un qui rentrerait, admettons, au début de sa maîtrise, qui déciderait de rester avec nous jusqu'au post-doctorat, peut tout à fait rester. Après ça, c'est en fonction de l'intérêt des personnes et du temps qu'ils ont à consacrer au comité, qui est quand même un comité exigeant pour la relève. Mais voilà.
Merci, Sarah. So I'm just looking at the time here. I think that we have the group has one final slide to share before, sort of as our concluding remarks to this discussion. Great. So I think that sort of one of the speakers is just going to speak to one of these quickly. So I believe Uzma, you have the first one there.
Yes. So we were just trying to figure out how we can foster science policy capacity in the next generation of scientists in Canada. And I think one of the things that tends to be missing is that while we have quite a lot of these grassroots organizations in the works now, we still don't have good connections with the employers who will eventually hire a lot of us and a lot of the science policy practitioners. And I find this all the time, that when I mention to my employers that there's someone who's got a PhD or is involved in science policy, and they could be great hires, they don't know how to go about that hiring process. They don't even know where to look for them, but also they have no idea that these people could actually be have the right skills and competencies for what we do. So I find that there is a lot of work that needs to be done at that bridging between the employers and this actual grassroots organizations and the capacity that they are building. So we can basically the society can benefit from the competencies that we have.
Thank you. So let's try and get through the rest of these rapid fire. Shivani, you have number 2 there.
Right. So I was talking a little bit earlier about the cost involved. There was a question in the chat as well from Shweta about the cost for students and next generation researchers for participating and volunteering in these organizations. And I think Taylor also mentioned that as well with the internships discussion as well. So we need to reduce those kind of barriers, make it more inclusive, and make it kind of worthwhile to participate instead of awarding solely kind of a research-driven approach to graduate school, when a lot of us do end up going outside of academia for jobs and for careers, and are interested in applying our academic knowledge to science policy and to various other careers.
Thank you, Shivani. Number 3 here, Taylor, take it away.
Sure, mine's short. Make it free, make it less burdensome on the students involved, and increase the number of opportunities, because there are a lot of demand right now. So we need to have free, fun, accessible places for these people to gain that knowledge.
Fantastic. Moving along, Sean.
Well, I got a minute, so I'll just say make it accessible. We need platforms that, like I said before, are visible, that are easy to join, and where people can really get involved without really taking all of that burden of time and just start the journey in an easy place. And the point that Shivani brought up before, there, if you go and read our piece in the CSPC magazine, you'll see something called SciPol Canada, which is still in the works. We'll hear about it sometime soon, and keep an eye out on Twitter for that.
Thanks, Sean. And to round us out, Sarah.
Oui, alors moi, ça va faire du pouce à ce que nous a dit Taylor. Moi, ça serait plutôt une invitation pour instances décisionnelles à travers le Canada de faire de la place à la relève au sein de leur gouvernance. C'est vraiment une plus-value et ça vaut la peine.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for rounding out the end of the discussion there. You know, and I will just, there's one more point here about support the sustainability of science policy groups, networks, and organizations. If you are an organization, if you are in a position to help support these groups, listen to them when they come to you and ask for support or ask to collaborate with you on something. And like I said, when I opened the session, you know, it is everybody who has attended this conference, from government folks to academia to civil society, nonprofit organizations, it's our responsibility to open the door for the next generation and to give them the opportunities that they need and so richly deserve. So I want to thank all of you for participating in this discussion today and for closing out the 13th, I hope that's right, the 13th Canadian Science Policy Conference. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to CSPC, to Merdad and his team. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you all next year. Thank you so much.